Hello, I'm Peter Herbert and welcome to this month's short Insight Training CPD webinar, which focuses on journals testing. In view of recent changes to ISA's 315 on risk assessment and ISA 240 on fraud, journals testing is an area of big focus currently. The requirement's been around for a while, but I think the bar's been raised somewhat in terms of the expectations of cold file reviewers and professional bodies. What we're going to do in this short session is look at some of the common problems and how they can be addressed, look at the specific requirements of the new ISAs and how they change what's required in terms of journals testing, and also provide a little bit of regulatory feedback from the Financial Reporting Council. We often think about journals in conjunction with ISA 240 on fraud because I guess journals are quite an easy way, aren't they, for management or others potentially to manipulate the account. And I suppose with that in mind, it's always a key area of focus for cold file reviewers. A couple of comments we see on file in this area tend to be, first of all, that one, a sample of material journals was selected for testing. And I guess if you do take a random sample of material journals and look to validate them, that's not an approach which is not compliant with ISA UK 240 on fraud. But I think reviewers and professional bodies are increasingly these days looking for a more thoughtful approach to the way the journals testing might work. And quite often on files, comments that all material journals are being addressed by testing in other sections of the audit file, and therefore the journals test in that particular section of the file isn't really appropriate or required. That again, I think is fine, but sometimes you do wonder whether that throwaway remark really stacks up and whether that is indeed the case. And I suppose more appropriate in that situation would be a listing of all those material journals and then cross-references to the other sections of the file where the relevant testing and scrutiny has been performed. Okay, so just in terms of the review work we do, I'm just thinking about some of the common issues that we raise in this area. We do quite often query when people have performed a journal test, whether they're comfortable that they've been looking at a complete population. I guess if you're extracting a journal report direct from the client's accounting system, then that's going to give you reassurance it is indeed a complete population of journals that you're looking for or looking at. Sometimes if clients are extracting reports for you to pick from, are you comfortable, how are you comfortable that all the relevant journals have been included in that report, and you are therefore indeed sampling, if you are doing that, from a complete population. I think the approach increasingly, I suppose, in the area of journals kind of marries up with what we see from firms that do good substantive analytical review. It's saying, well, okay, what's our expectation of what journals we will see? Are there particular journals that are going to be there all the time? It could be making year-end adjustments for or month-end adjustments for prepayments and accruals and reversing those. It could be journals for depreciation, payroll, tax, these sort of things. And it might well be that those journals that are in line with their expectation require less detailed scrutiny. The ones we want to kind of almost weed out are the ones that are perhaps not expected, that may possibly be linked with potential fraud. And those are the ones we're going to look to investigate and review in more detail. And that's what I was talking about a moment ago when I said that rather than quite simply going for a random sample, think about the approach being more thoughtful based on an expectation and drilling down on journals that perhaps weren't in line with that expectation. When journals aren't in that category of expected ones, we are then going to look for individual journals in that sort of subpopulation to be identified for detailed review. Some firms might take a random sample approach. Possibly a more thoughtful approach is to scan that list of unexpected journals and drill down on ones that you think are particularly unusual and therefore require more scrutiny and more validation. I guess in that sense, it might well be that a statistical sample may not be the way to go in this area in identifying individual journals that require scrutiny, review, and validation. Again, thinking about what I mentioned about going in relation to analytical review, so often when it comes to substantive analytical review, the problem will be on file. There's not appropriate follow-up when perhaps there's been a variance between your expectation of what a figure should have been and what it was. And again, with journals, if you have had a particular explanation of why a journal was indeed posted, can we follow up on that? Can we validate that? Can we see documentary evidence of the explanation that we've been given? It seems really obvious, but sometimes that follow-up and validation is indeed missing from the file. But don't forget, it is always going to be a risk-based approach. And I guess if you're of the view, based on your understanding of the clients and the preliminary work that you've done, that it's very unlikely that journals would be used by a client to actually in any way, shape or form manipulate the figures, that may mean that in this area, it's a far lower level of risk in your mind and therefore far less work required. In other situations, not the case. But I guess if people are getting involved in doing maybe accounts preparation work, bookkeeping work, management accounting work for their less financially savvy clients, although those particular activities do create ethical issues, I guess it does mean that from an accounts preparation point of view, the firm will be all over the numbers. Less chance, one would imagine, therefore, that journals could in any way, shape or form be used to manipulate the figures in the accounts. That's fine. Low risk means less work, but obviously, as ever, do make that really clear by documenting your thoughts there on the file. Okay, let's then, having thought about the fundamentals, have a little bit of a drill down on the specific requirements of ISA 315 and ISA 240. We are doing a ISA 315, ISA 240 workshop as part of our spring 2023 program in late March, and we'll look at this in more detail then. But just in terms of, I suppose, the ISA 315 requirements, specifically required to think about controls in relation to journals, I put on the left-hand side of this slide the requirements of paragraph 26 of ISA 315. And yeah, I guess in the context of the way that ISA 315 works, there are relatively few categories of controls that you've got to look at, but controls in the area of journals is one. And I guess it therefore really reinforces the idea of how important the IAASB takes journal controls and how much seriously it takes, I suppose, the risk of manipulation in this area, and thus the importance of controls being understood, appropriate design and implementation work being done, and then I guess testing, if appropriate, in this area. A couple of points to flag. First of all, I suppose we're only going to be thinking about journals in the context of our assessment of a risk of material misstatement. So going back to the point I made on the previous slide, if your perception is that there's a very low risk of material misstatement in this area, whether through error or through fraud, it might well be you're not specifically looking at controls in relation to journals because you don't think they present a particularly high level of risk. Where that's not the case, then as you can see from the left-hand slide here, again, it's all about looking at non-standard journal entries to record non-recurring unusual transactions, or just reinforce the idea we mentioned previously that yes, there's going to be an expectation that journals are going to be used in a standard way all the time to actually post particular entries. But when we're into that non-standard category, that's when we've got to do more work to actually validate the relevant journals, but as it says here, to think about the controls that underpin their preparation and posting as well. Now, what controls might we be looking at? We might be looking at controls over access. So does anybody have the ability to access the accounting system to post journals? It might be controls around the ability of individuals to change journals once they've already been posted. It might be controls in relation to review of journals before they're posted. And it might be controls that require appropriate supporting documentation in relation to the file, even where journals have got over the line, have been appropriately reviewed, and then have indeed been posted. Now, having pinpointed the key controls in that area or in those areas, obviously, if controls are deemed to be important, very, very crucial as well to ensure that you're getting evidence of implementation, as well as the client's word for what those controls look like. And it might well be in this area that in terms of things like access controls, change controls, we're very much there depending on IT controls. And it might therefore be, in terms of the evidence of implementation work, trying to access the system to post journals, trying to access the system to change journals, and just making sure that those controls that the client says exist do indeed exist, rather than taking their word for it, but actually getting evidence of implementation of controls in that area as part of our audit work. If that all works and we're comfortable that the relevant controls do exist, we've got evidence of their implementation, and we think that the actual design of the control system of the journal system looks fit for purpose. Now, what are the outcomes going to be as far as the testing is concerned? Well, if we're comfortable about the way the system works and the way the relevant controls are going to work, that I guess will mean potentially from our side less substantive work. If we're less comfortable in that area, we might do more substantive work. It might even be that in terms of the whole journal area, we're going to test and place reliance on controls to significantly reduce the amount of substantive work we perform. That, I think, probably for many audits would be unlikely, because of course, journals are a very key aspect of ways in which management can override controls to actually manipulate the account. So I think, yeah, less work potentially off the back of that conclusion, but to test and place reliance, I suppose, in this area is not going to be a common theme for many of the firms that we work with and the audits that they undertake. Okay, that's 315. 240 then talks about the requirements in terms of testing journals. That's within paragraph 33. And what I think is quite good about the revised 240, it does sort of effectively flag it very clearly in, I suppose, the shaded elements of the relevant paragraphs here, what exactly is changing compared to the previous version. Remember that the revision to ISO 240 is very much a UK change, and therefore the shaded bits are the UK insertions off the back of the revision, and we can therefore, at a glance, very clearly here in paragraph 33, see what was there before and what's there now. This, remember, all comes into play for effectively 31 December 22 year ends based on the grey shading. The top part of paragraph 33A there, I think, is reasonably uncontroversial. So yeah, we're looking at manual or automated controls. We're looking specifically at controls involved or posted as part of the consolidation process, where we're looking at group accounts and therefore a group audit. I guess we always would be thinking about consolidation journals in the mix, really, but obviously important to make sure that that's very much sort of kind of reinforced there. We've always had to make inquiries of individuals involved in the financial reporting process. Specific requirement now to make inquiries of individuals with different levels of responsibility. Who's actually involved in posting journals day to day, as opposed to management at that higher level? What does that day-to-day system really look like? And what might the risks in fact be? So talking to a range of individuals with different levels of responsibility perhaps gives us a better sense of what the risks are than just asking management, who are bound to say there's very little risk of fraud in this area as far as the entity is concerned. There's always been a requirement to select journal entries for testing. Again, the specific point that's been brought in here is end of reporting period and post-closing. So yes, I guess once the ledgers are closed, are the journals being posted beyond that point, which are going to inform figures in the financial statements? Those clearly could be absolutely journals that are posted to manipulate the final figures. Again, one would imagine they would always have been kind of in the auditor's mind. That's a little bit more nailed down, I think, now, based on that new sort of wording, that new reference there to post-closing entries. I think what lots of firms will also do in terms of journals testing and thinking about that manipulation risk is perhaps look at journals posted in the subsequent period that might reverse journals posted pre-year end. Might they possibly, to some degree, be used to manipulate cutoff or to window dress? That, I suppose, all links in to inform as part of the work there on post-closing entries. And although there's no imperative to test journals posted during the year, what audit firms are required to do, and have for a while now, is consider the need to do that. And again, I guess because of the focus on this area increasingly, on the part of file reviewers and professional bodies, my thought would always be, why wouldn't you test journals posted during the period? And if you're choosing not to do that, I would say make that really clear on file, just to cover off the requirement there, to consider the need in paragraph 33A3 of the revised ISA. So we are going to be looking at journals for individual review and scrutiny. As I said, going back to my previous slides, what I think firms are increasingly doing is thinking very carefully about which ones they will indeed drill down on and look at individually. And I think more and more firms, even smaller firms, using data analytics tools to help them with that process, as we'll see in the next couple of minutes. Okay, so that's 315 and 240. The final thing to think about in terms of, I suppose, ideas here around the approach, just in terms of the feedback from the FRC, they produced a very useful report in the late part of last year on the work done on public interest entity audits generally by tier 2 and tier 3 audit firms. So very good feedback, I think, here for all firms, not only those getting involved in doing public interest entity audits. And what were they coming up with in terms of their feedback? Well, areas that they were probably saying they were not always quite as comfortable about, and where they were perhaps giving harder feedback to firms on the reviews that they were undertaking, was first of all that point about making sure the completeness of journal entry system reports that you're relying on. We made that point, didn't we, on the first part of this short session. Risk-based approach to sort of identifying journals for detailed review. Now that goes back to my point about what's the expectation, and what's outside the expectation probably informs what we're going to review in a bit of detail. That's where I think, without it being in any way, shape, or form an imperative, data analytics tools can be really helpful. They might score journals on a range of parameters. One thing that we, I think, as file reviewers quite often raise when firms do use data analytics techniques, that perhaps will say, yeah, well, we've got a score of more than 23, more than 10, more than 25, based on a range of risk characteristics we're looking for. We'll do a more detailed dive. Yet the firm set that benchmark of, whatever it might be, 13, 10, 23, 25. Why pitch it there? Explain, why the journals that have got that level of risk require detailed scrutiny, as opposed to journals with a lower risk. Well, that's a common point that we certainly raise, or we are seeing data analytics tools used. And I know the FRC have also said, in terms of what might for them make a journal unusual and be worthy of more detailed investigation, is possibly unusual accounts pairings for the posting. That again could be something that maybe gets thrown up by a data analytics tool. Possibly unexplained use of suspense accounts for posting. That again could be something that might give you a slight cause for concern and require a more detailed investigation, possibly in relation to the journal posted to that suspense account. Where journals have been raised for more detailed investigation scrutiny, thinking about who's posted the journal concerned, is that in line with your expectation, as well as the characteristics of the journal itself, so the who as well as the what. I know something which they would occasionally raise. And again, for a couple of firms we work with, they've sort of raised the importance, having done your detailed journal testing, of taking a step back and thought, right, having done all that work, are we comfortable that we did indeed set the bar at the appropriate level for detailed investigation? Is there more work required based on our conclusions of the various tests and the scrutiny we carried out? So a few practical points there, but it all comes back to risk characteristics and using those to drive the amount of detailed work that you've done. And then going back to my earlier points, if you have picked journals for specific review, insufficient evidence retained or documented. I think quite a lot of focus currently on sample sizes and sample size caps still. I know many firms are finding sample size caps, or the removal of sample size caps in some methodologies, a real challenge. You may remember the point that the FRC raised when they reviewed Grant Thornton's audit of Patisserie Valerie, was when they set the parameters above which more detailed review of journals was required on that audit. They set it effectively too low, which therefore meant they were looking at lots and lots and lots of journals in great detail. And because that was just an inordinately high number, they weren't able to actually find the time or the energy to validate and find the evidence to support the journals they were reviewing in detail. So getting that level is right, I think, important to make sure that you're looking at enough in detail, but not looking at too many. That, again, is a key challenge, I think, in a situation where you are looking at too many in detail, having the time and the energy to validate and retain the evidence on the journals concerned. Okay, so there we are. What have we done in this session? We've had a look at some of the common problems in relation to journals testing generally, and thought about how that might be addressed and what perhaps good looks like from an audit file point of view. We talked about the specific requirements of 315 and 240, focusing very much in there on the risk-based approach, and shared a little bit of feedback there from the FRC, albeit directed at the tier 2 and tier 3 firms doing PI audits, public interest entity audits. That feedback, I think, is good for everyone doing audits and looking at work in this area. Any queries about today's session, do please drop us an email at inquiries@insight-training.co.uk. And for our full spring programme, including information on the upcoming ISO 315, ISO 240 website, do go to our website, www.insight-training.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Hope you find it useful. Speak to you all soon.